A grieving widower hired her only to cook for his 5 boys, until one stormy night. The pump handle was cold enough that morning to pull the heat right out of my palm. I remember that because I stood there working it long after the trough was full, just standing, the water running over the edge and soaking into the dirt, and I was looking at nothing, the way you do when you've been looking at nothing so long it starts to feel like looking at something. That was April, 8 months after Nora died. I won't talk much about Nora. She isn't why this story goes where it does. But you need to understand what those 8 months were, what the house was, what I was, before any of the rest of it makes sense. 5 boys, Caleb was 15, then Milo 13. Then the twins, Hank and Denny, who were 9, Denny with the bad ear from the fever he'd had at 3, Hank with the scar on his chin from a fall off the fence he'd taken the summer before and refused to cry about. Then the youngest, Reuben, 7 years old and still sleeping with a stuffed rabbit that Nora had sewn him before he was born, and nobody said a word about it. Not me, not the older boys. You don't take that from a child. So, 5 boys, me. A cattle ranch in the high plains of eastern Colorado, 4 miles from the nearest town, which was Alderton, which barely deserved the name, a general store, a feed yard, a church nobody kept up, and a saloon that kept itself up just fine. I want to be honest about what I was in those 8 months. I kept us alive. I can say that. The cattle got fed, the fences got mended, the boys got to school on the days the weather allowed and came home again and had something to eat. I can say all of that. What I cannot say is that any of it was done with the full weight of a man who was present inside his own life. I was going through the motions of a life I didn't feel attached to anymore, and I think the boys knew it, and I think they were afraid in a way they had no words for, and I was too far inside whatever I was inside to do much about it. Caleb had taken over the cooking. That's the thing that finally got through to me. 15 years old, and he was getting up before the rest of them and making cornmeal mush and whatever else he could manage because I'd stopped. I don't know exactly when I stopped. I just one morning registered that Caleb was standing at the stove, and that this had apparently been going on for some time. I said something to him about it, and he said, "It's fine, Pa, I don't mind." He did mind. You could see it in his face that he minded. Not angry, just tired and too old in the eyes for 15. And I thought, well, you're doing this to your son. You're making your son old before his time because you can't pull yourself together enough to cook a meal. I went to the Alderton General Store 2 days later and I put a notice on the board. Cook wanted. Ranch work. Room and board plus wages. 4 miles west. Ask for Holt Reardon. I got 3 replies in the first week. 2 of them were men, one I knew by sight, a drifter type who smelled of tobacco and something else I didn't trust, and the other was a former miner whose hands shook when he shook mine, and I felt bad about it, but I turned them both down. The third was a woman who sent her reply in a letter, written in a clean, careful hand, which told me she had some schooling. Her name was Ada Voss, widow, no children. Formerly of Dodge City, now of Alderton. She'd arrived 2 months prior following the death of her husband to a lung ailment, and she was looking for steady work. She said she could cook for any number of people, that she was not afraid of hard work, and that her references could be obtained from the Alderton minister, a Reverend Caulfield. I checked the reference. Caulfield told me she was the most capable woman he'd met in 20 years of ministry, and that whoever hired her would be fortunate, and he said it simply, not like he was selling something. Then I rode out to the boarding house where she was staying, because I wanted to see her in person before I decided anything. She was maybe 40, not much younger than me, dark hair going silver at the temples, worn back plain. She was sitting at a table by the boarding house window when the landlady brought me in, and she stood up in a way that wasn't nervous, wasn't performing any particular welcome either, just stood up, met my eyes, waited. I told her what the work was. 5 boys, ages 7 to 15, breakfast and supper primarily. Lunch was their own business, either in town at the school or out on the range with me. some baking when flour was in, dishes, laundry on Mondays. No other housekeeping expected. The older boys had chores. She asked me two things. First, was I expecting her to manage the boys or only to cook? I told her only to cook. The boys were mine to manage. Second, did I have a room separate from the main house, or would she be in the house itself? I told her there was a room off the back of the kitchen, used to be for storage. I'd cleared it out and put a cot in. She looked at me for a moment, nodded, said she'd take the job. That was all. No warmth, no chattiness, just clear, direct. I appreciated that more than I could have told her. I was not in a condition to deal with warmth. She came out 2 days later in a wagon I'd sent with Caleb, her 2 bags in the back. And by the time I got in from the east pasture that first evening, she had already made supper. Beef stew, biscuits, a dried apple pudding that Reuben said was the best thing he'd ever eaten, and I will tell you it was good. It was very good. And there was a moment at that table, the 6 of us around it eating food that hadn't been ruined and hadn't been grudging, and I felt something shift in the room. Just slightly. The way the pressure in your ears shifts when the weather changes. Something that had been held tight loosened by a thread. Ada ate in the kitchen. I didn't ask her to do that, she just did it, and I didn't stop her. She was an employee, and she seemed to understand that the table was a family space, and maybe she had her own reasons for not sitting with a man and his boys she'd known for 2 hours. I thought about it once or twice and then stopped thinking about it. She kept to herself. She was quiet. She was competent in a way that was so thorough it was almost invisible. Things simply got done, and the boys didn't fight about meals anymore, and Caleb went back to being 15 instead of 40, and I was grateful. That's all I was in those first weeks. Grateful in a distant way, the way you're grateful for good weather. It didn't touch me deep. What I want to tell you now is the small things, because the story isn't about one night, or not only about one night. The night was just when things came to a head. The story is really about small things stacking up, one on top of another, until the weight of them was something I couldn't ignore. She moved things around in the kitchen. Twice. Put the pans somewhere they made more sense, moved the flour and salt closer to the stove. First time she did it, I almost said something, and then I looked at the arrangement and saw it made more sense, and I kept my mouth shut. Second time, I didn't even feel the impulse to object. It was her kitchen, in the way a thing can belong to a person who uses it properly. The twins, Hank and Denny, started hanging around the kitchen after school. She didn't chase them off. She didn't talk to them much either at first. She'd just hand one of them something to stir or a bowl to carry, and they'd do it, and somehow they seemed to like that, being given a task without a lot of fuss around it. One afternoon I came in early from the range and I heard her telling Denny something in a low voice. I couldn't hear what, and Denny was nodding in the serious way he had, and she was showing him how to hold the knife to slice bread so it went clean and even. Nothing extraordinary. But Denny was a child who rarely let adults touch his hands because of the ear, because of some old anxiety tied up in it. And there was Ada Voss, holding his hand steady over the bread, and he wasn't flinching. I didn't let her see me watching. I went back out the way I'd come. Milo was the difficult one. 13 and a half and convinced he was the man of the house, which I'd never told him to be, and resented on his behalf. No boy should have to feel that, but they do. They can't help it when the mother is gone and the father is walking around like a ghost. He was rude to Ada in the subtle way boys that age are rude. Not saying thank you, not making eye contact, giving one-word answers. She dealt with him the same way she dealt with everything. She didn't get soft about it, and she didn't get stern about it. She just kept doing what she was doing, and she didn't require anything from him that he wasn't capable of giving. And eventually he stopped being rude because there wasn't anything to push against. About 3 weeks in, she started leaving a lamp on in the kitchen, just a small one, after supper was cleared and the boys were in bed. I noticed it the first night when I came in late from checking a fence line that had been worrying me, and the kitchen had that low warm light coming under the door. I stood outside it for a moment, just stood there. Then I went up to bed. She did it every night after that. I don't know how she knew when I was coming in, or whether she just left it on regardless, but it was there every time. The kitchen warm and quiet and the lamp burning low. I told myself it meant nothing. Practical woman didn't like a dark house. Made sense. I kept telling myself that for a while. The end of May, almost 2 months since she'd come. I want to say I was better by then, and in some narrow ways I was sleeping more. I was eating the food she put on the table instead of eating half of it and leaving the rest. I had started talking to the boys at supper again rather than just sitting there. Progress. The kind that looks like recovery from the outside and feels, from the inside, like a man relearning how to perform being alive. Caleb saw it. He was 15, but he was old in the way children of difficult times are old. And one evening he sat down next to me on the porch after supper, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "She's good for this place, Pa." He meant the house. He meant the food, the routine, the sense of order. He wasn't saying anything else. But I knew, because I knew my son, that he was telling me I was allowed to think so too. 15 years old, giving his father permission. And I sat with that and felt the weight of it and said, "She is," and left it at that. I want to tell you about the night the Farnsworth situation started, because it matters to what came after, and because it tells you something about Ada that I hadn't understood yet. Chester Farnsworth owned the neighboring spread to my east, about 2,000 acres, which was bigger than mine. He was not a bad man. He wasn't good either. He was the kind of man who's always been comfortable and so has never had to develop a full character, just went through life getting what he wanted because he had the means to get it and nobody much pushed back. He'd been a widower longer than me. His first wife had died when his own children were young, and he'd remarried years ago, a younger woman who'd left him eventually and gone east, and since then he'd been alone on that big spread with his ranch hands and his money and his restlessness. He came to my place on a Saturday, which was unusual, brought a bottle of bourbon, which told me this was a social call rather than a business one. I sat with him on the porch and we drank, and after the third pour he told me what he'd come for. He'd heard I had a woman cooking out here. He wanted to know if she'd consider cooking for him instead, double the wages I was paying. I told him I'd pass the message along. He nodded and then he said, "She's a widow, you said?" I said she was. Single woman then. I told him that was generally what widow meant. He took that with a small smile and said he might come around and talk to her himself one of these days. I said that was up to her. He left on that, and I sat there on the porch after his wagon had gone and turned the bourbon glass in my hand for a while without drinking any more of it. I told Ada about his offer that evening. Straight, no editorializing. Told her the money he'd named. It was a fair offer, fairer than mine, and she had no obligation to me beyond the arrangement we'd made, and arrangements could be unmade. She was at the sink. She kept her back to me while I talked. When I was done, she didn't turn around right away. Then she turned around and looked at me in that direct way she had, and she said, "I'm not interested in working for Chester Farnsworth, and I'm not interested in his wages, unless you're looking to end our arrangement." I said I wasn't. She said, "Then that's settled." She turned back to the sink. I stood there a moment, feeling, I don't know exactly what I felt. Something warm had moved through me, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I went out to the barn and I didn't think about it directly for several days. Farnsworth came around on a Wednesday after that, late afternoon. I wasn't there. I was out on the range with Caleb and Milo, moving cattle. He came to the door and Ada answered it. I don't know exactly what was said. What I know is what Ada told me that evening, matter of fact, like she was reporting on the weather. Farnsworth had come by. She told him she wasn't available for hire. He'd suggested perhaps she was lonely and might enjoy some company, and she told him that she was not, and would he please not come around again uninvited. I asked her if he'd given her any trouble. She said nothing I couldn't handle. And I believed her because I'd never seen anything she couldn't handle, but it sat in me uneasily. A man like Farnsworth, with a big spread and a sense that things ought to go his way. And Ada out here, 4 miles from town, with 5 boys who were not yet men. I didn't do anything about it right then. I wish I'd moved faster. June came. The wheat on the small field I kept for the house was coming in, and the cattle were good, and the older boys were out with me more days than not, learning the work, and Reuben had started following Ada around the kitchen with his rabbit under his arm, and she'd taken to letting him sit on the flour barrel and talk while she worked. He was a child who talked a great deal. Reuben, big words, strange ideas, endless questions. She answered all of them. Not like she was performing patience, but like she actually wanted to know what he thought about things. I heard her once tell him she didn't know whether the sky was the same color blue everywhere in the world, and that it was a good question. Reuben told her he thought it was probably bluer in some places, like maybe over the ocean. She said that sounded right to her. I stood outside the kitchen door for a while that day. I was not in love with her. I want to be clear about that. Or I was not yet in love with her is probably more honest. What I was aware of her in a way I'd been refusing to examine. The way she moved in the kitchen, efficient, quiet, no wasted motion. The way she looked at the boys when she thought no one was watching her look. Not soft, exactly, not sentimental, but attentive in a way that said she saw them. The way she dealt with every problem that came up. A leaking roof over her room. A cut on Denny's hand. A dispute between the twins that turned physical, with the same level, unhurried competence. Like nothing was a crisis because every crisis could be handled by the person willing to handle it. I was also aware that I had been dead inside for 8 months, and that being around her was making me feel less dead, and that I didn't know what to do with either of those things. And I was aware that she was careful with me. There was a distance she kept. Not cold, she was never cold, but deliberate. She never put herself in my way. She never lingered after she'd said what she'd come to say. She treated me with a kind of steady respect that felt, sometimes, like it was also a wall. I didn't blame her for it. She was a widow in a difficult position, and I was her employer, and the whole arrangement was such that a woman had to be careful. I understood all of that, but I noticed the wall, and some part of me that was starting to come back to life noticed it, and felt the loss of something I hadn't been offered in the first place. I should tell you about the night with Farnsworth before I tell you about the storm, because those two things are tied together, and you need the one to understand the other. 3rd week of June. I was in Alderton for supplies, had been gone since early morning, and I was later getting back than I'd planned. The wagon wheel had gone soft and I'd had to deal with that, and by the time I was heading home, it was past supper. The boys would have eaten. Ada would have fed them. I was thinking about nothing but getting the horses in and my boots off. I was a 1/4 mile from the house when I saw the second horse at my fence, Farnsworth's roan. I recognized it even in the low light. What I felt when I saw that horse, I'll try to describe it accurately. It wasn't quite anger, not at first. It was something colder and more alert, the way you feel when something's wrong that you don't yet have a name for. I came up the lane fast and I was off the wagon before it stopped rolling. The front door was open. I went in and I heard voices in the kitchen, and I heard Ada's voice, and it was the same as always, level, unhurried, clear. And I walked in, and Farnsworth was sitting at my kitchen table with a glass that he hadn't poured himself. He'd brought the bottle. Ada was standing at the stove with her back to him, and the set of her shoulders told me exactly how long he'd been there and how much she'd wanted him gone. He looked up at me and said, "Reardon, glad you're back. Came to talk to you about the east fence line." And that was a lie, and we both knew it because there was no matter pending between us about a fence line. I told him the fence line conversation could wait until a proper hour, on a proper day, and that he was welcome to leave. He didn't move right away. He looked at Ada. Then he looked at me. Then something in his face settled into the calculation of a man deciding whether to push, and he decided not to, and he picked up his bottle and went. I stood in the kitchen after he'd gone. Ada still had her back to me. The pot on the stove was already clean. She'd been standing there to have something to do with herself that wasn't looking at him. She turned around after a moment and her face was composed, the way it always was, and she said, "Your supper's in the oven. Boys are in bed." I said, "He give you any trouble?" She said, "Not the kind you're thinking." A pause. "He came in uninvited, said he'd wait for you. I told him you might be quite late and he said he didn't mind." The distance in her voice when she said that. Something there, behind the composure. I said, "I'll speak to him." She said, "You don't have to on my account." I said, "I know I don't have to." She looked at me then. First time in a while she'd really looked at me, not the professional glance of someone reporting information, but something more direct and less guarded. It lasted only a moment. Then she said good night and went to her room, and I stood in the kitchen and ate my supper cold and thought about that look for longer than I should have. I did speak to Farnsworth. Rode over the next morning and spoke to him plainly, the way you do when you want there to be no misunderstanding. He had a certain amusement in his face, which told me he thought this was about a man protecting what was his in the old territorial way. I let him think it. What mattered was what I said, which was, "Don't come to my place without being invited, don't speak to my people without me present, and don't make me say this a third time." He said he understood. I believed him mostly. Men like Farnsworth respect a line drawn clearly, even if they'll test it occasionally just to keep themselves feeling like they have options. I rode home. The morning was clear, blue sky all the way to the horizon, and I found myself feeling something close to not anger anymore, not that cold, alert feeling. Something more like the way you feel when a thing that needed doing has been done, and you can set it down. So now we get to July, the 12th of July. I know the exact date because it was 2 days after what would have been my wedding anniversary. 15 years. I'd been married at 26 to a woman who was worth 10 of me and somehow wanted the one of me there was, and we'd had 15 years together, and then she was gone. The anniversary day itself I got through. I worked the whole day and I worked hard and the boys left me alone about it. Even Reuben seemed to understand, in the way small children sometimes understand things without being told. I got through the day and I thought, well, still here. 2 days later was the storm. It had been building since noon. That greenish light in the afternoon, that means something serious is coming. The air going still and then swinging into gusts, and then going still again. The cattle moving restless along the fence line. By supper it was dark in the west in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. And by the time the boys were in bed, the thunder was rolling steady, and the lightning was working across the sky in great long sheets. We got the horses in. Caleb helped me, and he was good about it, steady, not rattled. By the time we'd secured the barn and come back to the house, the rain had started. Not that thin preliminary rain, but the serious kind, sideways with the wind, and the thunder was close enough now to rattle the window glass. I got Caleb in. Checked on the younger boys, twins asleep, impossibly. Milo reading under his blanket with a lamp. Reuben sitting up in bed with his rabbit looking at the window, not crying, just watching. I sat with Reuben for a while. Told him what the storm was doing and what it wasn't going to do. Told him the house was solid and the barn was solid and we were all right. He kept watching the window. He said, "Mama used to sit with me in storms." I said, "I know." He put his head against my arm and I put my arm around him, and we sat like that while the storm banged around outside. And after a while, his breathing slowed and I got him laid down and tucked in, and I stood up and stood in the doorway of his room for a moment with the thunder coming hard and near. And something cracked open in my chest that I hadn't let crack in a very long time. I went downstairs. I didn't have a plan. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't that room, and I ended up in the kitchen. Ada was there. She was sitting at the table, not eating, not doing anything in particular. Just sitting with a cup of something, the lamp low, the storm against the windows. She looked up when I came in and she didn't seem surprised to see me, which was either because she'd heard me moving around upstairs or because she was a woman who wasn't often surprised by things. I sat down, not at the far end of the table, not making a statement, just the nearest chair. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The storm hit the house in gusts and the lamp flame shuddered and steadied. After a while she said, "Was it the anniversary?" I looked at her. She was looking at her cup. I said, 2 days ago. She nodded. Let that sit. I said, how'd you know? She said, Caleb mentioned it a while back, not to me, to Milo. I happened to be nearby. Another stretch of quiet, thunder, then a long silence after it, then more. I said, I'm all right. She said, I know. Something in how she said it, not like she was agreeing to be polite, but like she knew the difference between a man who was saying I'm all right because he needed someone to believe it, and a man who was saying it because he was gauging how far from all right he actually was. She knew which one I was, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I put my hands flat on the table, big hands, scarred across the knuckles from 25 years of ranch work. I looked at them. I said, I've been not right since she died. I know that. I know what it's looked like to the boys. She didn't say it was fine or that I'd done my best. She just listened. I said, Reuben said tonight she used to sit with him in storms. There it was. The thing I'd been carrying since I came out of his room. I said it, and it sat in the air between us, just sat there, and something about the way she didn't flinch from it, didn't rush to fill the space around it with comfort words, let me breathe for the first time in a long time. She said, after a moment, he remembered the right thing about her. I said she was good at that, knowing when to sit with a person and when to leave them alone. So are you, Ada said. I looked up at her. She was looking at me now, not at her cup, straight on. She said, you've been sitting with all 5 of them for 8 months. In all the ways that count, you've been right there. Even when you couldn't feel it yourself. I said, that's a kind thing to say. She said, it's not a kind thing, it's a true thing. I've been watching. Your boys are not damaged children. They're grieving children who still trust their father, and that's down to you. The lamp shuddered again. Rain was coming down so hard it sounded like gravel on the roof. I said, I don't know when it gets easier. She said, I don't either. Mine's been gone 2 years. I still reach for him sometimes, just habit, just the shape of a thought, expect him to answer. She turned the cup in her hands. But it does change. How it sits in you. The weight doesn't get smaller, but you grow around it. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. But I felt it land somewhere in me. Not as a comfort exactly, but as something true from someone who knew. We sat for a while. The storm was moving through, the thunder getting farther between. The rain was still hard, but the wildness was going out of it. She said, can I ask you something? I said she could. She said, when you hired me, you didn't want warmth, did you? From whoever you hired. You wanted competence and quiet and someone who wasn't going to ask anything of you. I said, is that a criticism? She said, no, I'm the same. When I took the job, I wasn't looking to be asked anything of either. Pause, then she said, I'm telling you because I think that's changed for me. And I'd rather say it plainly than have you figure it out some other way and not know what to do with it. I was very still. The kind of still that happens when you're not sure whether what you're hearing is what you think you're hearing. She was looking at me without flinching. She said, I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. You have 5 boys and a ranch and a grief that's not finished yet, and I've got my own life to account for. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give or that doesn't make sense to give. But I think you deserve to know that I've been glad to be here. Not just for the work. I've been glad of you specifically. And your boys. Outside, the thunder rolled once far off, and then there was only rain. I said, "Ada." She said, "You don't have to say anything." I said, "I know." And then, because there was no other true thing to say, "I've been glad of you too." She nodded, no performance around it, just received it the way she received everything, steadily, without requiring more than what was given. I should have reached across the table. I think she would have allowed it. But I wasn't ready, not quite, and she seemed to know it, and she didn't push. She got up after a while and put her cup in the sink, and she looked at me once more before she went, just looked, the lamp light on her face, her eyes level and kind, and then she went to her room. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. The rain quieted, the lamp burned. I sat there with my hands on the table, and I thought about what it felt like to be seen, actually seen, by someone who had no reason to see you particularly well, who owed you nothing beyond the work, who had looked at the hollow thing you'd become, and found something there worth saying was worth finding. It was not a small thing. I don't know how to say it and make it sound like what it was. After 8 months of being the shape of a man, something in me said, "You're still here. You're still a man who a good woman can sit with in a storm and choose plainly to say she's glad of. You're still that." I'll tell you about the weeks after the storm, because they were not all at once. That's not how it works when you're a careful man and she's a careful woman and there are 5 boys in the house and a grief that's not finished. It was slow, and slow was right. She kept to herself and I to mine, but the distance changed character. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was more like 2 people giving each other room because they respected each other enough to not rush a thing that deserved not to be rushed. The boys noticed. Boys always notice. Milo noticed first. I think he came to me one evening and he didn't say anything, but he looked at me for a moment in a way that was both question and answer, and then he just nodded slightly and went off. Caleb noticed too. He started making himself useful in ways that took him out of the kitchen more in the evenings, which I appreciated without saying so. Reuben, on the first morning of August, climbed into the kitchen while Ada was starting breakfast, and he told her he was glad she lived here, just like that. The way 7-year-olds say true things. She said she was glad too. He showed her the rabbit. She asked the rabbit's name, which was Herbert. She said she'd always trusted the name Herbert. Reuben decided this was the best possible opinion she could have had, and after that he brought Herbert to the kitchen every single morning, and Ada said good morning to Herbert every single morning, and I watched this from the doorway with something in my chest that I had forgotten the name for. The last week of August I asked her to walk with me after supper. We walked out past the garden and along the fence that ran by the east field, and the evening was cooling after the heat of the day, and the light was long and golden on the grass. I told her I was not a man who said things well. She said she knew that. I told her I was not finished grieving and I didn't know when I would be. She said she knew that too. I said, "I think you're a remarkable woman, and I think what I feel when you're around is something I want to keep feeling, and if you're willing, I'd like to take that somewhere. Carefully, on your terms." She was quiet for a while. We walked. The fence line ran straight ahead of us and the sky above was going peach and gold. She said, "I didn't come out here looking for this." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not an easy woman. I'm set in my ways and I say what I think and I don't soften things when they don't need softening." I said, "I know all of that." She stopped walking, turned to face me. She said, "Your boys are good boys, Holt. Whatever happens between you and me, they should know that they're the reason I stayed as long as I have, the boys in this place, and I need that to mean something to you." I said, "It means everything." She nodded. She looked at me for a long moment, and it was the same look she'd given me in the kitchen the night of the storm, that straight, level, unguarded look, and then she put her hand on my arm. Just her hand, resting on my forearm where I'd pushed my sleeve back, her palm against my skin in the cooling evening air. "All right," she said, "carefully on both our terms." I put my hand over hers. That's all. Just held it there, the two of us standing by the fence in the long August light. I will tell you the end of it, though the end is not really an end. Farnsworth sold his spread the following spring to a family from Kansas, and I never had to speak to him a third time. The boys grew. Caleb went east to learn some engineering the year after, which was what he'd always wanted and what I made sure he got to want. And Milo turned into a man who fixed things, who could look at a broken piece of machinery or a broken arrangement between people and figure out what it needed. The twins grew into themselves. Denny got most of his hearing back eventually, which the doctor said was unusual, and Hank grew to be the tallest of all of them, which surprised everyone who'd known him small. Reuben turned out to have a gift for letters, of all things, and Ada was partly responsible for that because she'd answered every question he'd ever had and treated every one of them as worth asking. Ada and I married in October, quiet, just the boys and the minister. She kept the name Voss alongside mine, Voss Reardon, she said, not one or the other. I told her that suited me. It did. I want to tell you what she gave me, because I think that's the heart of it, the thing this whole story has been working toward. She didn't rescue me in the way they put in stories. She didn't ride in and mend me, didn't fill the hole Nora had left, didn't give me back what I'd lost. That's not what happened. What happened was smaller and truer than that. She sat with me in a storm and told me what she saw when she looked at me, which was a man who was still there, still doing what needed to be done, still worth seeing. And then she chose freely, with her own good judgment and her own full life to account for, to stay and see me. That is worth more than I can say. You get to a certain age and the world starts telling you, in ways that don't always use words, that what you were has gone, that the best of you is behind you, that you've already been whatever you were going to be. And then a woman looks at you across a kitchen table in a storm and tells you plainly that she's glad of you, not what you used to be, not the younger version of you, not some story she's making up. She's glad of you, this man right now. I will tell you that I was still there, and I am still here. There's a spot on the east fence where we walked that August evening, and sometimes in the late afternoon when the light goes gold, Ada comes out to where I'm working, and she stands beside me a moment, and we look at the same patch of sky. She doesn't say much. I don't either. Herbert the rabbit has been gone for years, and Reuben is grown, and the house has been quiet for a while now, the particular quiet of two people who have made a life together and are not sorry about it. The pump handle is warm in my hand by the middle of summer, most years. I noticed that once, and then I noticed I'd noticed it. And it seemed to me that a man who is present enough to notice what the morning feels like in his hands is a man who has come back to his life. She did that. She came to cook supper for 5 boys, and she sat with me in one bad storm, and she told me the truth about what she saw, and she let me come back. I don't take it lightly, I never will.